My name is Dr. Michael Brown, and this is 3 Words, a bite-sized podcast about the very strategic choices that we can make in order to make the world a better place. And that is really the conversation with my son, Ethan, today. How to make the world, how to make our communities, how to make our nation a better place because of our giving. You're going to love this conversation. It is in depth. It is heartfelt. Listen in. Well, son, I have been eagerly anticipating this day when I get you to be in the studio for the very first time, my son, Ethan. But I know you well, but most of our listeners and viewers have never met you. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Of course, yeah. Well, good to be here, Dad. My name is Ethan Platt. I currently work as an affordable housing specialist for the state of Nebraska. Just moved there with my wife about a month ago. But prior to that, was working in international development, have nonprofit background experience, particularly in housing and supporting immigrants.
So this topic is very, very relevant for you, which are these 3 words.
Choose better charities.
This is actually a conversation I've been wanting to have with you in the studio for a very long time. And I've been initiating with you to have this conversation for years. And you were a little hesitant because you're like, what do I have to say? Or what does it look like to be in the podcast studio with my dad? But the reality is you are the expert in this area. In fact, from the very earliest of days, your mother and I, we kind of coined the phrase for you that you are the DFW, or the Director of Family Wealth. In fact, for the past several years, Mom and I have reached out to you and said, okay, here's the amount of money that we have. What charities do we give to? Coach us, consult with us, help us know how to make our dollars go farther. And so we love being able to take cues from you and to think about how to most effectively be generous in our lives, because generosity is obviously one of our core values as a family. And so to have this conversation with you is really a privilege and an honor. So just talk to us. Why is this topic of choosing better charities so important to you?
Of course, yeah. Well, I think Americans gave almost $600 billion last year to charities and nonprofits, but not many people think super deeply about where they're giving, or we give impulsively or on a whim without really doing a lot of that research. And I think if our viewers are anything like me, there are lots of cause areas and things we're passionate about, areas where we want to see improvement in the world and make a difference. But it can be difficult feeling like, man, there's only so many hours in the day that I could volunteer. I only have so much money to give. And I think the thrust of this conversation is that we don't all have to give more in order to make a bigger difference. We could just give a little bit more strategically, deliberately, consistently. And in doing that, we can maximize our impact even without necessarily increasing our giving.
Well, we were talking a little bit off camera too, and you were saying there's really not a such thing as really, really bad charities, but how do we know where to give? Like, how do we know what is a good charity and what that even looks like? What's your process?
Of course. Yeah. Well, I think one thing to know is that, I think it's really uncommon that there's bad charities. Most charities or nonprofits do good work. But what we find in the nonprofit space is that some charities are way, way more effective per dollar than others. Some of them have done the research. There's very evidence-based tools for what strategies work best. And so an example that comes to my mind when I think about when I first started getting interested in this conversation, this topic, is about 7 years ago, I got introduced to the effective altruism movement, which essentially says we should give not just with our hearts, but with our minds, and really give strategically to maximize our impact, not just give to feel better about ourselves, right? And so the example that I read about in a book that still kind of sticks with me today is there was a nonprofit in Kenya in the early 2000s, and they were trying to increase school attendance of primary school children. They found that absenteeism reduces life expectancy, it makes kids sicker, reduced literacy rates, reduces their incomes later in life, all these different areas. So they had this nonprofit that really wanted to get kids in school more and was trying to think of creative ways to do that. And they did a randomized controlled trial, which is where they picked 40 schools in this area in Kenya, and they said, we're going to try different strategies in a handful of different schools and really see what works best. And what they found was they had a couple ideas. They had one subset of schools where they provided more teachers. They had one subset of schools where they provided free textbooks, thinking maybe kids, that was a limitation for them. And then a different school or subset of schools, they provided free uniforms, thinking that also could have been a limitation. And what they found was those three interventions, if you will, were mildly effective at increasing attendance for kids, but they were missing something. And when they consulted the nonprofit consulted the World Bank and said, man, what are we missing? And the World Bank said in Kenya, and in this particular area that they were exploring these schools, intestinal worms actually was a really big issue with children. It was kind of keeping them home from school. You'd get these intestinal worms that were prevalent in that particular area in Kenya, and then kids wouldn't be able to go to school. They'd be sick for a long time. If they did get better, which the fatality rate was pretty low, but even if they did get better, they'd be weaker. They'd be less able to pay attention in class when they did return. And so for a subset of schools, they added this deworming initiative where really, really cheap to have these medical interventions that made you immune to this intestinal worms that were plaguing kids. And what they found was the deworming intervention was 143 times more effective than the least effective of those other interventions. So it was 143 times better per dollar to give kids these deworming interventions than to provide more teachers, for example. And that's not just 143%. I want to clarify it. That would be 14,000% better dollar per dollar. And so you would make a bigger positive impact giving $8 to a deworming initiative than if you gave $1,000 to a nonprofit that was providing more teachers for these schools.
Well, I'm inspired. I've never heard that story from you, son, but it's what I'm hearing from you, what I'm learning from you, even in this conversation, is that good intentions do not always equal great impact. And so how can we? What are the metrics? Like, you obviously gave one example, but my guess is you're using some of these ideas and metrics across a variety of charities to know which ones to choose. Because that is the 3 words: choose better charities. It's not avoid bad charities, but how do we actually maximize our dollars?
That's right. Yeah. Well, I think one thing that we tend to look at, and in the nonprofit world, we all kind of roll our eyes when people talk about overhead. It seems like people are really, really interested. Well, I want to know how much of my dollar, if it's 80 cents on the dollar, 90 cents on the dollar, actually goes to this work. And I can, in a sense, I can understand, and probably before I was involved in this space and in the nonprofit, public sector and social sector myself, I would have understood that. But now I think a lot less about overhead and some of those factors, and I think a lot more about per dollar impact. And so in every cause area, there are different strategies, like we talked about with the schools in Kenya. So I work in affordable housing now, and in affordable housing, at least in Nebraska and probably across the country, you can tackle that issue by building new housing. You can build affordable rental units. You can take houses that are falling into disrepair and doing rehab. You can provide low-income folks with down payment assistance because they might be able to cover the monthly mortgage, but they don't have $50,000 up front to do the down payment. And so there are a lot of ways to do things. If you think about food insecurity, you can have food banks in different places, or you could have, people talk a lot about food deserts in areas where it's harder to access food. Even I think about a lot of Americans give to cancer organizations and foundations because we all like to give to things that have impacted our lives. So if you have family members or friends that have been affected by cancer, you want to give to cancer research, or you want to give to nonprofits that are assisting in that way. But I think we often think about overhead, but instead I would encourage people to think about per dollar impact. And every 501c3, which is the nonprofit designation in the United States for nonprofits, they all are required to do these annual reports where they will talk about what they did in the year. And many of them, there's been a large move towards actually talking about return on investment. So every $1 you put in this nonprofit produces $18 in social benefit. And I think those are the kinds of things to look at. And so I think about overhead. You might have a nonprofit that has zero overhead. Like I could imagine a nonprofit where it's run by a retired person and they don't take any pay from it. And let's say they want to give books to libraries and school libraries. You could give $1 there and they would buy a book and send it straight to that school library. And you would feel really good about yourself thinking 100% of my donation went to this really good cause. But I would challenge our viewers and kind of challenge my own thinking about that. Wouldn't it be better to give $1 to a nonprofit that instead had maybe spent 10% of their income on research and 10% on hiring really good staff and 10% perhaps on investing in a building. And what if we looked at the research that said maybe one of the best interventions for kids is not having additional books in their libraries, but having an after-school program where they can go and have a safe place to spend some time, where they can get some food. Their parents get to work more. If it's a single parent household, the mom or dad gets to work a couple extra hours, bring in extra income for the family to invest in the future education. Kids are spending time in these after school programs. They're less prone to criminality or less likely to be incarcerated in the future. And so in every cause area, there are a lot of different strategies, but some have been proven to be far more effective. And so rather than looking kind of those easy numbers of, 82 cents on the dollar goes to the actual cause, it'd be better for us to say, what could $1 do if given to this nonprofit versus what could $1 do if given to a different one?
I'm going to hit pause in this fantastic conversation with my son, Ethan, to invite you to share this episode with one of two people in your life, maybe both. The first person is the person who's ultra generous and they love giving to charitable causes, but might need to focus their giving a bit. And then secondly, to someone who says, I'm not quite ready, or I think I need to wait a while before I can begin being generous. Now back to the episode. Now, this might be a personal question, but there are probably certain nonprofits, and you've suggested some to Mom and I, that you feel like are doing that kind of work. Can you give us, maybe pull back the curtain and give us a sense of what some of those might be that actually you feel like are really good?
Yeah.
Some of people are going to be listening going, I want to do that, but where does Ethan give?
Of course. Yeah. Well, one that I have been a strong proponent of ever since I got involved in effective altruism is called GiveWell. And they are a nonprofit that actually grades and does research on other nonprofits. So they do, their whole model is built around researching what are the nonprofits that per dollar can do the most. And I give directly to GiveWell, and then they distribute and say, okay, we have 9 charities this year that we've really done the research, and we know for a fact that in 2024, the most effective per dollar impact we could have is to these 9 nonprofits, and they'll distribute from there. But there are lots of different charity navigators. There's lots of websites where I think all nonprofits are starting to understand that people want to see the evidence, because for a long time, what's been the case is that nonprofits are kind of aware that we don't really do well with numbers. We can't think about, $1 could save, or $2 could save a life here, or $5 could prolong someone's life or help a kid get an education. What nonprofits tend to do is they'll put a picture of someone that they've helped and say, this person was helped by our nonprofit last year. And that's really helpful. But what we're finding is that people like you and I and people all across the country are having these conversations and trying to understand, wait, what if there was a way to do research and actually back it up? So I think GiveWell is one of those that I really, really would stand for. And then I think any nonprofit, if you have this cause area, let's say you are interested in cancer and you're trying to decide, do I give to a cancer research foundation? Do I give to nonprofits that help families that are impacted by cancer? All of them have to publish these annual reports and actually talk about what they're doing. And I think another thing for me is just listening to experts. And so I think as the director of family wealth, among the nonprofits we've talked about is we want to give one nonprofit at the end of the year that is engaged in racial justice work, one that's involved in climate change and environmental sustainability work. And in picking the best one for each of those, what I have done for our family is listen to the experts, because for example, I care a lot about environmental sustainability and climate change, but I'm no expert there. I don't understand the science behind it. I don't know if it's better to clean up the oceans, or if it's better to reduce carbon emissions, or to improve energy efficiency in homes. But if I listen to the experts that are telling me, we think this year in this particular climate we're in, the best thing we could do is invest in the project in this way, we'd have a lot higher impact. And so I'm kind of an affordable housing specialist now, but in any other area that I want to give, I want to ask people and not just say, I think the oceans probably are where we should focus our time. But if there are climate scientists out there that are saying there's better things we can do, and I think all of us have people in our lives that have some specialization or some interest in some of these areas, that actually ask and say, man, you're involved in this space and I'm passionate about this. What do you think is the best thing to contribute to in order to have this positive impact?
Fantastic. So son, make this practical for our listeners. Make it practical for our viewers. Like, what do we do? How do we put this into practice strategically, deliberately, consistently? frame it for us as you wrap up this conversation.
Absolutely. I would say if there are causes that our listeners are interested in, to do some research. I think if you're currently giving, or if you have some consistent giving, you're giving each month, or maybe you do one-time gifts, I would encourage you to really peel back the lens and look underneath that and say, what are a couple causes I'm passionate about? And can I sit down for each of those causes and do 1 hour of research and look at what some experts are saying in that field about what's most effective? And then I would also encourage, if you are one of those folks who tends to give a little bit more emotionally or impulsively, it can feel good to, we want to give because it makes us feel good, or someone asks us to give to a certain cause and we feel guilty. We give out of guilt instead of giving out of a determination or conviction that this is the best way to create impact. I would say, try to give more consistently, because nonprofits really, really benefit when they can rely on your $10, $20 donation each month to continue their operations and doing these meaningful things. And I would just say, if you're a listener who's maybe, I think I've had this conversation before and people have pushed back and said, but shouldn't I get to choose what I give to? Like, if I'm contributing to nonprofits, if I'm doing good, then shouldn't I just be able to go about this in any way that I please? It is true that giving is a very personal thing, and people should have some autonomy over that. But I would also challenge us that if there's any area of our lives that shouldn't be fully about us, it ought to be our giving. I never want to be a person who's giving fully based on my preferences or my opinions about how things ought to be fixed in the world, but listening to others and then actually thinking about the end goal beneficiaries. If I care about kids in Kenya going to school, if I care about cancer patients in the US, if I care about people that are unhoused in the US right now, I want to think about what's best for them, not just what makes me feel best when I'm making those giving decisions.
I want to have one more quick conversation before we wrap up, and this is around the topic, because you said selflessly. Obviously, we want to think about this entire area selflessly. Let's talk just briefly about generosity, because I think that oftentimes what came to mind as you were sharing some of these thoughts, son, was I work with college students who say to me on a regular basis, I can't wait to graduate, to get that first home, to start my family, to get established, to build a foundation so that I can be generous, so that I can begin to put into practice some of the things that you're saying. But I think you and I would probably both agree, most of us can probably give a little bit more. Most of us can probably give a little bit more consistently or more generously. Can you talk a little bit about that before we wrap up our conversation?
Yeah, I mean, particularly in America, it's true that most of us probably could afford to give a little bit more than we do. And some of us could afford to give a lot more than we currently do without really affecting our standard of living. I recognize, and I work in a space in Nebraska and in affordable housing, working with lots of folks that really are very low income and do not have a lot to give. And so I think the fun thing about this conversation is it presents an opportunity that even if you only can give $5 a month to something that you care about, you have an opportunity to maximize that impact if you do a little bit more research and are a little bit more thoughtful and strategic about it. And I think I would also share that if you are doing the research, I think I found this for myself when I got involved in this space 7 years ago and was reading about effective altruism and reading about some of the most high impact interventions that we could have in the world. I got more excited about giving. So if any of listeners are wanting to get involved in this space, but they're not feeling very motivated to give, or it feels difficult or burdensome to do so, I would encourage, do some research first, even before giving. And then I know for me, once I knew where every dollar was going, and I had the data to back it up that said every $5 I give to GiveWell, for example, this year is going to provide an anti-malarial bed net for a kid in East Africa and reduce their chances of contracting malaria by 92%. And if they don't get malaria, then they'll live an extra 25 years on average and earn this much extra income. All those things really matter to me. And so when I'm deciding between, do I want to get one more cup of coffee this week, or do I want to give $5 to provide this bed net, then it feels a lot more substantive. And so I would say, if you're giving currently, do some research to make your giving higher impact. And if you're not giving, do some research first and then see how that shapes your heart and motivates you to want to give just a little bit more.
Son, I'm very proud of you. I'm so thankful that not only are you helping the world, but that you are continuing to be the director of family wealth for the Brown family. And yeah, because we all want to be more generous. We all want to make an impact. So I am so inspired by our conversation. And thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Ted.
What a great conversation with my son, Ethan, today. I hope that you were encouraged and inspired and even have practical steps on how to become more and more generous. That said, we love being connected to you, our 3 Words podcast viewers and listeners. Would you even go deeper with us? Would you go to dmbcoaching.com/subscribe, where you can actually start receiving our digital newsletters that actually many of them are research-based around the conversations that we're having today, to be able to grow and develop and become the very better version of yourself and to make a greater impact in society. We'll see you in a couple weeks.